The time is currently 4:15. My name is Hans Krager. I am Ultimatum number 5, and this is the weekend ultimatum. By the day and date this video is uploaded, you will obviously realise that this is not the weekend. Unfortunately, this is Wednesday, the day before the 23rd of June 2016, which is a Thursday, and that is the date of the UK's in-out referendum of whether the UK should remain a part of the EU or leave the EU. So, why is it so late? Sorry, first of all, to those who were expecting this earlier. This is really cutting it fine. Recent events have sort of forced me to push this to this date, not to mention the fact that the amount of research that has been required to carry this out has been staggering. And first of all, I'd just like to thank a number of organisations that include the BBC, Channel 4, UK Fact Check, the Metro, London Evening Standard, the Times, and the Northern Echo for their invaluable columns and facts on the EU. It's certainly been worthwhile reading them. So, that's not to mention, of course, Wikipedia. Anyway, let's begin. So we'll launch straight into it. We'll first of all talk about what the EU is, and basically the EU started off life as a single market agreement, more commonly known now as the EEC, or the European Economic Community, and this basically was, as I said, a single market free trade agreement that removed tariffs on goods, and mind you, it's only goods traded between different countries. So what are tariffs? First of all, when I export something to a country, I have to pay a tariff to that country in order to bring up the price of my product to that of the level of the homegrown products from that country, or higher, in order to give the homegrown products a chance of competing with my product. Because usually if I'm able to export that far, I'm quite big and I'm producing high quality stuff. Well, why would I remove these tariffs if I was in the EEC? Surely that will kill off homegrown businesses. Not necessarily, especially if they maintain a monopoly at a local level. The EEC's job is simply to maintain a fair and equitable trade across this effectively now borderless zone of 500 million people. Borderless only in terms of the trade of goods, I should remind you. This now effectively large area where I can trade with whomever I like, this very open marketplace that prevents unfair treatment to smaller businesses. It's all fair, it's all streamlined. So, where does the EU fit into all of this? Well, in 1973 the UK joined. In the 1980s, Greenland left. Now, they left because of the common agricultural and fisheries policy. This was enforced to keep farming and fishing products at a level that just met demand so that prices didn't fall. Farmers get subsidies in return to match what they would have made had these regulations not been in place to limit their production. So then, in 1992, that was when the EU was first officially formed in a treaty that's known as Maastricht, one of the 3 pillars of the EU that's now being replaced by the Treaty of Lisbon. The Maastricht Treaty basically established the EU, and it also established the EEC as an actual organisation. So, it also established the euro currency in in the 1990s, but it wasn't actually officially adopted as the official currency until 2002, although within the Maastricht Treaty was a provision that new countries would have to adopt this currency when they joined the EU. We tried that in 1990, in the 1990s, I think it was around 1995, and it didn't exactly work out well. We also joined a currency exchange system which caused our markets to crash, basically, so that didn't really work out well for us either. Next, in 1995 came the Schengen Agreement, and this basically said free movement of people, but it also had the no passport zone, and that no passport zone only exists between the countries in effectively mainland Europe. UK has an opt-out of this. So basically now we're at 1995. From 9 countries at the time the UK joined to now 28 countries who are now part of the EU. Actually, that was probably around the time of the early 2000s that we had 28 countries. Next came the treaties of Amsterdam and Nice, which basically evolved powers to the European Parliament on decisions such as home affairs, justice, and a common foreign and security policy. It also established what is known as the European Communities Act, which basically gave the European Parliament the ability to pass these laws and effectively pass them on or enforce them in the nations that made up the EU. These were all consolidated along with other EU legislation into one single treaty known as the Treaty of Lisbon by one single treaty known as the Treaty of Lisbon in 2009, which basically updated and amended the treaties of Maastricht and Rome, the original treaty that set up the EC, giving the EU's Bill of Rights legal binding, and as well as consolidating legislation, appointed the first president of the European Council and gave council ministers a majority rather than unanimous voting control over EU policy. So what do we have now? What is the EU? So the EU currently consists of 28 member countries. Now the EU consists of its political arm and the EU, as in the EEC, the European Economic Community. But the EEC also has attached to it the EEA, the European Economic Area, and that basically extends the list of countries to include Norway, Iceland, Liechtenstein, Luxembourg, and Turkey, and a few other countries that are now vying to join the EU. And this basically means that they have also got to accept free movement of people. They also have to accept a number of EU laws, but they are now part of the single market. Furthermore, Switzerland is part of what is known as the EFTA, or the European Free Trade Association. It's kind of on its own in that it's in a unique agreement that it's able to negotiate how many treaties it wants to sign to how much of the single market access it can have. So that's nice. So what then still, we haven't quite answered the question, actually makes up the EU? I mean, what's it divided into? That's a good question. So let's get on to it. So, and again I apologise for the fact that this is so complex and so time consuming. So there institutions that form part of the Union and help run it within the EU. That's basically what the EU is. and they consist of the Commission and the Council, as well as basically the countries themselves, the Parliament, and all the other institutions. So the Commission basically comes up with new legislation. They are the civil service. Like our own Parliament, they devise new policies, but unlike our own Parliament, the commissioners appointed by each of the heads of state, so David Cameron will have appointed his own commissioner, and they get randomly allocated a particular policy. Well, not randomly allocated, they do vie for a particular policy, and usually it has been economics. Britain's commissioner has often been in control of economics, except under Gordon Brown's time when it was in control of foreign policy. So they come up with ideas for new legislation. The Commission comes up with the legislation. The legislation is then passed on to the European Parliament. The European Parliament, which is elected by us, and there's no way in saying that that's undemocratic. It is democratic. We do elect these MEPs. There are 29, so we have the highest, among the highest numbers of MEPs, in fact the highest, including Germany, France and Italy, 29. And even though we are technically outnumbered by the other EU nations, we still have a vote on this. Once the law is passed in the European Parliament, it is then passed on to the European Council, which the European Council, the European Council, which basically includes heads and ministers, and they basically sign off on all this EU legislation. Now, the European Council really consists of the heads of the EU member states, and they meet and set the direction of the EU, and this happens every 2.5 years at EU summits. And basically they will elect every 2.5 years a new president to represent the EU in things like the World Trade Organization, or meetings of the G7, not the G7, but meetings of various countries, for example, climate change talks and so on. The Commission also comes up with an annual budget for the EU and allocates funding. So that's basically the EU in a nutshell. So what should we go on to next? Well, let's go on to laws for the time being, and we will come back to the main core arguments of remain and leave. So EU laws, as I say, developed by the Commission, voted on by the European Parliament, signed off by our own ministers. Now, we can have a say in whether we want to disagree with them or not, but often that isn't the case. And in most of the most costliest laws, and indeed in just general regulations, which are often to do with economics and keeping the fair and equitable trade across the EU, as I said before, it is simply just not in our interests to remove them, because either we already had them and these are simply updates, they were passed, or they were passed by a global consensus, for example at the UN level, or they are so in favor of business and support business that it would seem ludicrous to try and not avoid passing them. And in fact, many businesses find that it's just a lot easier to comply with them rather than oppose them. That's not to say that there may be costliness associated with them, it's just that it's not worth removing them, or indeed, if it was worth it, it's not beneficial to just leave it as it is without replacing the regulation, or even with replacing the regulation, which may be costlier. Now, Vote Leave has, and I will refer to the two campaigns as Leave and Remain, even though the official campaigns are Vote Leave and Britain Stronger in Europe, respectively, simply for simplicity. So Vote Leave argued that the UK voted against 55, or rather Nigel Farage argued that they voted against 55 pieces of legislation between 1996 and 2014, or rather technically, if we include all recent legislation, still till 2016. In fact, Vote Leave argues that we voted against 72. Nigel Farage's figure is actually closer, in fact probably more correct. The UK voted against 58 policies that the EU came up with, but these are very obscure. Things like the regulation of bananas or trademark reforms. Now, the trademark reforms, basically the UK didn't want surpluses from the trademark reform, excess money going to the EU. They wanted it to go to them directly. But otherwise they agreed with much of the trademark reform, and they imposed their own version of the law. But the UK has said yes to 2,466 policies. Now, the reason why the 58 figure is correct is actually it's only correct up to 1999. Between 1996 and 1999 we have no data, and unfortunately Vote Leave has failed to provide us with any data that would confirm the 72 law figure that it says we voted against. Right, in terms of the total costs of these laws, Vote Leave has argued, and many of its economists have argued, that £33.3 billion a year, or 2% of GDP, is the cost of implementing these laws, according to the impact assessments. Whether or not that's the actual cost of them, I think it remains to be seen. I haven't been able to check those figures. The stated benefits of those laws are £58 billion per year, but because of the lack of progress on things like environmental regulations globally, those benefits have yet to pan out. So technically these regulations cost us more than they benefit us. But importantly, these regulations concern things like social employment, so that's workers' rights, financial regulations, particularly banking regulations, and the environment. And most economists agree, even some on the side of leaving the European Union, that there would be no saving if we decided to remove them. Some say there would be a £13 billion saving, but that is unlikely, as of course, as I said before, those 100 costly regulations actually benefit the UK's operation as a whole. So then, where to go next? Let's look at the arguments for Vote Leave and Remain. And let's start off with Remain. Now, first of all, I want to point out that I am still undecided, even though it is Wednesday, the day before. This is crazy, but there are arguments that I am inclined to support on both sides of the camp. So let's begin with Remain. Remain say that we will be losing hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of jobs. Our economy will collapse, and we're unlikely to recover, and that even if we wanted to trade with the EU, we would have to accept much of the regulations, which we would not get a say on, and that overall we would be worse off economically, which is kind of the whole point of the EU. Leave say that that's rubbish. If we leave the EU, we'd be able to trade more freely with other countries outside the EU, and that would make up the shortfall, and that who's to say that we won't stop trading with the European Union? Well, for starters, let's look at the figure that's been bandied around by Vote Leave for a number of weeks, which is pure rubbish. It is, of course, the £350 million a week contribution to the EU. We don't net contribute £350 million. We do actually give £350 million, but most of that, over half, comes back in the form of subsidies, grants, and the rebate. So the rebate brings it down to 275 million, and then the subsidies and grants for things like the agriculture and fisheries policy for the poorer communities in Britain, so that includes Wales and the north of England, and also for funding the arts, for funding universities. That comes back to us, bringing the total to around 160 to 190 million that we give to the EU. Vote Leave argues that's still a lot. The Remain campaigns say that if we take into account the investment benefits of remaining a part of the EU, that more than enough makes up for that. But Vote Leave say that, well, actually, we could be using that money to fund the NHS and various other things. Okay, well, that's roughly £8.5 billion a year, assuming that you continue to spend on all those areas, which they probably will have to, because not doing that will probably cause those areas of Britain to collapse. And let's be honest, the people on the side of Vote Leave are people who have carried out fairly strong austerity measures. Let's hope that they will stick to this promise, and I think they will. I do not think they will commit political suicide. Mind you, if Vote Leave actually win, then it's likely we're going to have a new government anyway. So, let's move on to the main argument that we will lose a huge amount of economic stability. Both sides agree that the economy will slump in the following 2 years after we leave the EU. This slump will be caused by the fact that we initiate Article 50 of the European Communities Act, which gives us just 2 years to leave the EU, although that can be extended at the discretion of the EU to allow for further negotiations. So, what happens? Well, as I said, both sides have agreed that the economy will slump in the short term, but in the long term, nobody knows. And it is unfortunately most of Vote Leave's argument. Nobody knows. In fact, Nigel Farage said himself that we will be like, or rather the MEPs in the European Parliament, should we leave, will be like the canaries in the mine shaft. That's a pleasant feeling. Going down knowing that you'll either be smothered by methane and die, or fly away, leaving the miners to think that you'd be fine, and then they light a match and everything goes kaput. So, economics. It is a difficult argument. According to the Treasury analysis, which is supposed to be independent, now unfortunately, because of the number of establishment figures, all of whom have some connection to the EU or to the government who is on the side of the EU campaign, many consider that many of these reports are not exactly reliable reports, particularly ones from things like the CBI, which is on the side of Remain. Well, the Treasury say that our economy will be 6% worse off than if we were to remain in the EU. It will be 6% down on its GDP. Dividing that difference per household gives you a £4,300 loss in income. Now, that's not strictly speaking true. It may be larger for those who are poorer. It may be larger for those who are richer. It just depends on what kind of industry they're involved and how badly it's affected. Now, the main argument for leave is that we import more than we export, so we're not exactly gaining much from being as part of this union. And that's true. We do in fact import more. And let's face it, most of our economy is not manufacturing, it's services. In fact, 79% of it is services, and services are not covered by the free trade agreement. That is a problem. So is the European Union actually working for us as an economic union? Well, it doesn't stop European countries from investing in us heavily, or outside investment to the EU through us. For example, the Nissan manufacturing plant up in Sunderland, which is not that far from me again. Again, another one that's not that far is the one in Newton-Aycliffe, the Hitachi plant, Hitachi Europe. There are also a few other car manufacturers, and we in fact are right at the top of car manufacturing exports, despite Germany being the sort of centre of car manufacturing, because simply we get a huge amount of investment from foreign countries. That includes the United States. Unfortunately, Vote Leave argues the fact that we are unable ourselves to be on things like the World Trade Organization as an individual country, and unable to negotiate our own trade deals unless we are as a bloc with the EU, means that we are significantly weakened. And to be honest, it's true. The EU has been unable to negotiate deals with countries like the US, India, or China, despite negotiating for several years. It's notoriously slow. The countries it has negotiated with are fairly poor countries, things like the Mercosur, which is the South American Association of Free Trading Partners, or things like South Africa, and these are not free trade agreements between them, but simply bilateral trade agreements. Again, no tariffs. Again, tariffs are involved rather, but you know, it's just simply slightly easier to export and import between these foreign countries. Then what about then that the UK might suffer a £36 billion black hole? Well, George Osborne there is referring to the deficit, which is currently at an unsustainable level. Currently, the UK's deficit is roughly 7% of GDP. At 5%, things are usually worrisome. At 7%, it's problematic. Should we leave, this might rise. And that gives us a gap of sort of 20 to 40 billion pounds, the 36 billion that George Osborne predicts and the Treasury predict, which have to be plugged in by either increased taxes or longer periods of austerity, not something that the EU wants to go through, or rather the UK wants to go through. As for the 3 million job figure, well, that's assuming that we cut off all ties with the EU, as Vote Leave claim. But even so, if we decided to remain with the EEA rather than forming our own bilateral agreement, and incidentally our GDP would not be so severely affected if that was the case, then, well, it wouldn't stop a number of jobs from being lost. And indeed, even Boris Johnson admitted in a TV debate last night that he cannot guarantee that jobs would be more or less after the leaving of the EU. Nobody really knows, but we're hoping more, because of course the EU also allows the free movement of people. So let's get on to that. Immigration. A tricky subject. The free movement of people stipulates that people from across the EU are free to move between different countries as like goods and services, or rather just goods, are able to cross the borders without extra tariffs or extra checks being imposed on them, that they are able to live in another country and experience the same benefits and style of life as individuals living in that country. It basically wants to normalize living standards across the EU and then simultaneously raise them throughout the EU. And this particularly applies to Eastern European countries who are recently joining. In fact, a lot of our money is going towards those regions in the form of regional development funds, and that's simply, the idea behind that is you give money to poor people, they have more spending power, they spend it a lot on services which improve education and other things, they get raised in a better way, they invest more in the other countries, they grow as an economy, the whole EU grows. As of recently, the EU has had terrible growth, the UK being probably the only one that's had outstanding growth, in fact probably the only one that's grown at all, and Eastern European countries are still quite seriously hit. But then you also have Spain, Greece and Italy, of which the main immigrants are now coming, although we still experience a huge influx from Eastern Europe mostly. But what's the worry? Surely migrants are a good thing. I mean, we've got 100,000 of them supporting our health and social care services, 52,000 of which work in the NHS. That's a huge amount. Well, the worry is that cheap workers will drive down the wages. And if you think about it, the more you have of something, the lower the demand, and therefore the lower the price has to be in order to encourage greater demand. So the prices fall. It's basic economics, and indeed it's the same thing here. Although, let's put this into perspective, we do have a minimum wage. Unfortunately, not everybody wants to be on a minimum or indeed the national living wage, which, by the way, is not a living wage if by definition of a living wage you mean a wage that covers all the living standards costs that we currently experience. It is simply a rebranding of the minimum wage, which has been slightly raised and will be rising, but not in line with current living standards or inflation. But what can you do? So, is immigration bad? Well, we're also experiencing a huge influx of refugees at the moment. But immigration encourages competitiveness both in schools, in the marketplace, and indeed in terms of the ideas and skills that we have to be able to power this country. So migration is a good thing, but at the same time it does place a burden on public services. That's unquestionable. And let's indeed go into the particulars of this. So right now, what we're considering at the moment mostly is the effect migration will have on security. And that is the key point made by a lot of the Vote Leave campaigners, apart from the security of jobs. And it's undoubtedly true that a lot of the chains, for example, Wetherspoons, which support Leave, also rely heavily on European migration. It'll be harder for us to be able to rely on that in the future, but maybe if we're outside of the EU and not part of any European Economic Area or EFTA, etc., then we can still control immigration in a bilateral agreement such that we can cope with it and develop our services to be able to grow our country in a way that's sustainable. Well, maybe. But what about the argument that terrorists can get through using this immigration system? Well, first of all, we have to show our passports when we get to the UK border if you're an EU citizen but you are not a UK citizen, because remember, the UK does not subscribe to the Schengen area. So the UK still receives information from what is known as the Schengen Information System, and this basically exchanges information over, controlling borders and managing it, particularly via Frontex. Frontex is the European Union's border force control agency, and they'll include things like if they're wanted on the European arrest warrant, if they are a particular danger for whatever reason, public health, public policy, etc. So, what happens if someone comes to this country? Well, we can still block refugees, and most, in fact, they all have to settle within the first country that they arrive in, but this relies on them being effectively tagged and checked in. So if they escape this process, as we have seen in a number of cases, and they move on to a different country to seek asylum or refuge there, then unfortunately there's nothing that country can do except either to stop them at the border and force them back, or to accept them and put them in what they are currently doing, into sort of detention centres before clearing them and eventually resettling them. Well, other points are that EU migrants, particularly Eastern European migrants, are highly beneficial to our economy. They are net contributors. But are many of the refugees? Well, the answer is we don't really know, but we can tell from certain ethnic groups that it tends to be that those of Indian, Pakistani or Bangladeshi origin tend to be poorer contributors. In fact, they're worse than us. We are not net contributors to our own economy. They are even less so. But it tends to mean that the second generation accounts for that, and the second generation, remember, are born in the UK. So, we still haven't addressed whether or not terrorists can enter the EU. Well, they can't. Or rather, they have a very small likelihood of entering. And that's because we share information about them through Europol, which is the EU's Interpol system. And basically, that ensures us to be able to exchange information on whether someone's a terrorist and what activities that they have been up to, any suspicions about that person. Remember, they have to show their passport, and remember that has a biometric chip on it now, which now enables information to be linked in effectively with all the countries throughout the European Union and indeed across the world. So then, what happens? Is the EU then still vulnerable to terrorists? Is the UK still vulnerable to terrorists? I mean, if it can still cross borders without passport? Well, no, it isn't. I mean, what difference does a chip make? Well, it's not just the chip, it's the laws that the EU has placed. The UK can refuse someone entry into this country within the first 3 months, or deport them, of course, if they feel that on an individual basis, i.e. assessing that person alone, external of any prejudice or sort of generalizations referring to particular groups that they may be conforming to. So, for example, you cannot simply refuse a Muslim because they are Muslim. You must refuse that person if they have proven links to terrorism. And this includes public policy, public health, and indeed public security. And we'll just get on to that. apologies, this is a huge amount of information. Right. There. Okie dokie. Right, that's very odd. Here we go. So within the next 3 months to 5 years, we can then deport on the basis of public policy and public security. This is just slightly stepped up, not just for public health or anything like that, but things that are quite serious. A criminal record does not prevent you from entering the UK. Citizens in this country have criminal records, yet they go all over the place. A criminal record only prevents you from entering a country if it's so serious under public policy or security. For example, if you are someone who has repeatedly raped women and reoffended despite being incarcerated several times, and that you pose a danger, you may even be prevented from leaving the country, but let alone entering a country. Within the next 5 to 10 years, we're now getting to even more serious public policy or public security threats. Public health, as I say, has gone out the window, because by this time you're really thinking of someone who's permanently resident in this country. They may even be seeking citizenship by this time. So it would seem kind of stupid to refuse them public health, and they've probably net contributed enough to pay for their own healthcare. Remember, we also get refunds based on the migrants who've come from the EU and are using our healthcare system. But again, we pay more for our own citizens who have gone abroad. Let's not forget that in many countries it's not just a publicly funded system, but there is some element of paying insurance, medical insurance. So that also factors into increased costs. Beyond 10 years, they can only be deported if they present an imminent danger to public security. And that's really, the most serious of people. So that will include terrorists who we think are extremely dangerous. So there we have it. And let's not forget the fact that the UK has an excellent police force that has managed to stop multiple terrorist attacks. Very rarely has it failed. So, what other arguments are there for remaining or leaving the European Union? There are in fact a host of arguments which range from things like, again, the regulations and laws, to basically a question of identity. And the European Union has often been seen as a completely different set of culturally completely different nations. It may be a clue that we keep losing the Eurovision Song Contest over and over again, and often end up close to the bottom half, because Europe is just simply on an almost different wavelength. An argument proposed by Nigel Farage suggests that our security would be better if we left the EU. Now, a number of generals signed a document, or a letter rather, stating that they wanted to remain in the EU, or supposedly signed, because then a number of those generals then said, no, I didn't put my name on that. And it also included MI5 officials and MI6 former heads and heads of security and foreign policy and this, that and the other. But generally speaking, even most foreign nations all support us remaining in the EU, because they think that we have a better connection within the EU, connected to NATO and the UN and a number of other organizations that are concerned with security and economics, than if we left. And indeed, a number of current and former generals support this. But those who are against it have good reason. Though it was dismissed originally, one former UK general suggested that the European Union is developing the idea of a collective European Union army. Now, of course, it was originally dismissed, but in fact, German ministers have unveiled a white paper on developing just that. And that is partially worrying. Next, the idea of Russia being a threat. Now, these generals argue that if we devote more attention to NATO, which already has partnerships throughout Eastern Europe, the UK can still have its influence against Russia. Let's consider two arguments against that. First of all, that as an EU bloc, the EU bloc will be able to impose multiple sanctions on Russia, though again, being part of NATO, that can also be arranged, and also being part of NATO, we can mobilize our forces quite quickly. With the EU, of course, it has no forces, and if there was some sort of policy agreement on foreign policy, well, that again would have to be discussed. You've also got to bear in mind that Nigel Farage argued that there wouldn't have been a Ukraine annexation if the EU hadn't tried to fiddle with the economics of Ukraine, which was already perfectly happy being with Russia, or rather its establishment. If we look at the Ukrainian effective civil war and the Ukrainian crisis, and we'll look at that in more detail perhaps in another video, we've got to also bear in mind that effectively West and East Ukraine are split, mostly because West Ukraine is denying much of Eastern Ukraine its parliamentary sovereignty. It's rarely and gets very poor representation within the parliament. And in fact there have been many fights over this. And it's rather like the Northeast in the United Kingdom, in that it rarely gets any representation, it's fairly cut off from funding, and generally seems estranged from the main politic of the entire country. Russia took Crimea and annexed it from the Ukraine, and the fact was that Russia still had many of its military bases there. So in effect it was fairly easy, and Ukraine probably shouldn't have let Russia had access to that. But they did, and well, we are where we are today. Of course, the EU also signed up to an agreement when the Berlin Wall fell that we would protect the Ukraine. This is, of course, in some way reneging on this promise. But NATO may be experiencing some changes. Remember, we've also got an American election coming up, a general election, and one that might change the course of history if Donald Trump wins. Donald Trump wants to pull out of NATO, mainly because of the amount that the Americans spend on NATO. Yes, we're all raising it to 2% of GDP contribution. Remember that the Americans spend an awful lot on defense, far more than many other countries combined. So it seems crazy that Donald Trump would try and pull out of that huge union, which would ease his requirement of spending locally. But it's simply because that many of these countries don't work together. particularly in the UN, where there are things like vetoes happening left, right and centre. Furthermore, Donald Trump wants to be able to focus on countries not part of this sort of establishment and focus again on countries like India. Now, the key question here is Russia a country we can cooperate with? Obviously, with the Ukraine crisis, we're imposing a hell of a lot of sanctions. Then with the Syrian crisis, Russia is getting involved, and again, we're worried. The fact is that Russia is still a major player and someone we probably should cooperate with. Remember, Russia is friends with India, and India is right on the border of many countries that are promoting extremism, and India is the only one that seems to be against it, openly and in secret, using the war in Kashmir and Gujarat and several other bordering states to try and drive out the number of extremist attacks which keep happening on their doorstep. There's also the problem of Chinese influence, which is growing and is starting to infringe on Russia's and India's borders, as well as Japanese and Indonesians and several others. And Chinese influence over North Korea would certainly be something quite useful, as would Russian influence. So Russia is a key strategic player. Not to mention that if we cooperate, we're more likely to come to a solution over the Ukrainian crisis than if we continue to supply weapons to the Ukrainian forces, which are just going to end up killing more people. But at the end of the day, these crises are far more complex than I could just simply talk about in the 5 to 10 minutes or so that I've spent in this video. So, are there any more arguments? Well, let's turn to our Brexit papers. Please bear with me. So, again, here we are looking at the main arguments, and often there are economic arguments. And one of the economic arguments is that if we just opened our free trade agreements, just got rid of all tariffs and opened our borders and said, hey, come and trade with us. We're removing all tariff restrictions. You know, okay, we're going to regulate borders to an extent that not so many people can enter in, but anyone can trade with us, and they can trade at any price and we'll be fine. Well, LSE have modelled that, and it doesn't look good. Unfortunately, the economy is likely to either shrink by 1% or grow by 2%. That's not as much as it would normally grow if it was part of the EU, which means that we will have made a net loss. There are also other arguments within migration. If we adopt an Australian points-based system, Australia, wonderful country that it is, it has perfect gun regulations, which the Americans could learn something from. And it also has several other supported policies, but it is mainly conservative, and the Conservative government is currently hindering immigration into Australia, particularly from poorer countries such as Indonesia, India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, etc. In fact, it's paying countries to harbour these immigrants and keep them away from Australia. And it has its points-based system, which basically allows a limited number of people to enter Australia by checking their qualifications against a number of points which they will earn if they are highly skilled and qualified enough to fit the requirements that the Australian government need. Let's first of all bear in mind that Eastern Europeans make up 60% are made up of low-skill workers. You have some students, which helps increase the diversity of universities, and they are cleverer, and they offer more competition, which means that places are still restricted, despite the fact that more UK students than ever before have gone to university. But as I said before, 60% of EU migrants are basically low-skilled work. This country needs quite a lot of it, as does Germany and several others. And in fact, a lot of the European population would fall if we lost this migration into our country. So it's quite useful to have these. But under a points-based system, this would be reduced. However, let's look at the number of people who came to this country last year. That's 333,000. Of those, 184,000 came from the European Union. So that means a sizable chunk came from outside the European Union. We're restricting immigration from the rest of the Commonwealth in order to cope with that from the EU, and the EU immigration is expected to rise. Yes, that is unfortunate. But there is a but. An Australian points-based system is likely to double the amount of immigration into the UK, or that's according to Remain. They argue that given the fact that we're looking at the US, India, China, and all these other emerging or fully developed economies with fairly intelligent people who are wanting to emigrate to the UK, that number is going to go up, and because they're going to be likely to meet all the points that we require. Besides, we need unskilled workers more than we need skilled workers. Most of our graduates are coming out of university, and well, they're coming out with very high skill qualifications into a world where there are very few jobs for them in that department. So low skill it is, unless of course they want to take that, and sometimes that isn't the case. It's often the case that a lot of EU migrants take on the sort of summertime temporary work or seasonal work, and that's reflected in the number of national insurance numbers that are issued each year. Again, that's something to be reflected on. But then let's look at what would happen if we decided to block all immigration from the EU. Well, Commonwealth immigration will probably go up. But if we were to apply the same restrictions as we did for both the EU and outside the EU, it will probably drop by a third to about 200,000. So then what is the overall picture going to be? Well, it will not mean that our immigration gets reduced to the tens of thousands. In fact, that's probably going to be very unlikely, and even if one government managed to get it down that low, I don't think that they would keep it down that low for very long. They would just simply do it to prove that they could do it. And this is an argument voted for by Migration Watch, an independent think tank which monitors levels of migration and simply states that current levels of migration are far too unsustainable to be able to support current public services. So, any other arguments? Well, concerning the laws, remember, even though Britain came up with the minimum wage and anti-discrimination laws, we got our maternity leave and our paternity leave that's paid from the EU and several other workers' rights. And remember that the Bill of Rights gives us far more greater protection from the EU than it does if the UK were to develop its own Bill of Rights under David Cameron, which has been criticised as being far too liberal. However, again, you've got to bear in mind that the EU is principally an economic establishment which seeks to support business. There's also the matter of upcoming trade deals. Remember, the EU is developing the Transatlantic Trade Investment Partnership, or TTIP, with America. That investment is a problem. The problem is that people are worried that TTIP will influence the NHS, or that private services will claim that the NHS has an unfair share of the market in this country. It is likely that we will put a note in the annex, or that we will get a special exemption within the rule of the agreement itself. However, there is also the point of public health legislation. Famously, many of these agreements often include things that cover advertising and trademarks, and this has often been exploited by cigarette companies. Let's hope this doesn't happen here and that there's an exemption for public health legislation as well. It also may harm our own business if, legally speaking, we have to adopt a number of US laws because of things like ISDS. These are secret courts and secret laws and lawyers which basically rely on these trade agreements to counteract and defend particular business decisions or attack governments to be able to expand their business in a particular way. And now a lot of these courts are held here in the UK, specifically in London, and these are international. But thankfully, TTIP is still a few years away. Even though it's being hammered out in secret, MEPs still have to debate on whether this agreement should be passed. So that's another thing. But this has been a fantastic way to research this. It's been great to be able to research things like pensions, which may lose their triple lock, that is, their triple exemption from the three main taxes that affect them. That may be lost in the case of a Brexit. Now, I've refrained from using the word Brexit purely because Brexit sounds like a laxative or one of those chunky choc chip oaty nutty filled bars that you find in a pound store. So it's basically bad, or bad sounding in the sense, but in fact leaving the EU may just as well be a sound decision as staying. We're just not quite sure. Well, certainly I'm not. Most of the establishment, most economists and the government say yes. There's still a hardcore support who say no. Well, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. We've covered quite a lot. There are several more arguments to be made, and right now I hope that I've covered enough of the arguments that you need to make an informed decision. Thank you very much. This has been Weekend Ultimatum with Ultimatum number 5. See you later.